In 1980, American television produced one of the most powerful films ever made about the Holocaust, and it arrived inside one of the medium's most bitter casting controversies. The woman chosen to play a Jewish survivor of Auschwitz was an outspoken supporter of the Palestine Liberation Organization. The real survivor she was portraying was still alive, and she was horrified. What followed was a storm of protest, a boycott, a ban, and a film that became a landmark anyway. This is Playing for Time, the 1980 CBS television film written by the playwright Arthur Miller, directed by Daniel Mann and starring Vanessa Redgrave as Fania Fénelon, a French Jewish musician who survived Auschwitz in the camp's women's orchestra. Jane Alexander appears as the orchestra's conductor. It is an unflinching account of women spared the gas chambers because they could play music for the people murdering everyone around them. Today, we're counting down 13 facts about Playing for Time, and stick around for number 1, because the true purpose the real orchestra was forced to serve is more harrowing than anything the film chose to show. Hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment about a Holocaust film that stayed with you. These stories matter, and they are kept alive by being told. Let's begin. The decision that defined the public life of Playing for Time before a single frame aired was the casting of Vanessa Redgrave in the lead role. Redgrave was one of the most acclaimed actresses in the world, but she was also one of the most politically outspoken, and her vocal, high-profile support for the Palestine Liberation Organization had made her a deeply divisive figure, especially within the Jewish community. To cast her as Fania Fénelon, a Jewish woman who endured Auschwitz, struck a great many people as not merely insensitive but unconscionable. The backlash was immediate and enormous. Jewish organizations protested. There were calls for boycotts of the film and its sponsors. The controversy became so heated that the film was initially banned in Israel. Other actresses on the project were reportedly approached and asked to make a public statement against Redgrave's involvement, and they refused, instead issuing their own statement condemning the idea of blacklisting any performer for their political views. The film had not yet reached audiences, and it was already a national argument about art, politics, and who has the right to portray the suffering of others. Redgrave herself later took the unusual step of appealing to officials in Jordan to purchase the broadcast rights, expressing a wish that both Arabs and Israelis would be able to see the film. The casting question hung over the entire production and never fully lifted. The most painful objection to Vanessa Redgrave's casting did not come from an organization or a pressure group. It came from Fania Fénelon herself, the living woman whose life the film was depicting. Fénelon was still alive when Playing for Time was made, and she was outraged by the choice of Redgrave, opposing it on multiple grounds. She objected to Redgrave's politics regarding Israel. She felt the actress physically wrong for the part, even remarking that Redgrave was too tall, and she believed Redgrave fundamentally misunderstood her. Fénelon's preferred choice to play her had been Liza Minnelli, a piece of casting that would have produced an utterly different film. She continued to criticize Redgrave's involvement on speaking tours across the United States even as the production went forward, and she remained critical of the film until her death in 1983, only 3 years after it aired. One of her deepest frustrations was artistic rather than political. Fénelon insisted that humor had been one of the things that helped her and others survive the unbearable, a flicker of human resilience in a place designed to extinguish it, and she felt the grim, unrelenting film had stripped that humor away entirely. The woman at the center of the story spent her final years disowning the most famous telling of it. Playing for Time carries a remarkable name in its writing credit. The teleplay was written by Arthur Miller, one of the towering figures of American drama, the author of Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, and A View from the Bridge. For a playwright of Miller's stature to write directly for television was itself notable in 1980, a moment when the prestige of the stage and the screen were considered worlds apart, and his participation lent the project enormous artistic weight. Critics widely judged the result to be among the strongest writing Miller had produced in years. There is an unusual wrinkle in the history of the work. Miller adapted Fénelon's memoir into the television screenplay first, and only afterward reworked the same material into a stage play, also titled Playing for Time. This reverses the usual direction of traffic between the two forms, where a successful play is typically adapted into a film later. Here the screen came first and the theater followed. Even so, the stage version has remained one of Miller's lesser performed works, rarely mentioned alongside his celebrated classics, in part because it sits uneasily in his catalog as an adaptation of someone else's testimony rather than an original creation of his own. Miller's involvement is also quietly poignant given his own history. He had spent the 1950s as a target of the anti-communist blacklist, hauled before Congress and convicted of contempt for refusing to name names, an experience he had transformed into the crucible. He understood from the inside what it meant to be punished for one's politics, which makes his steadfast defense of Vanessa Redgrave against the campaign to remove her especially resonant. The writer of the film had lived his own version of the question the film's casting forced upon the country, whether a person's political beliefs should disqualify them from their art. It is Miller writing in a mode of witness rather than invention, carrying another person's memory to the stage. For all the protests that surrounded it, Playing for Time was met on its airing with enormous acclaim and a remarkable audience. It was the single most watched primetime program on American television during the week it premiered in 1980, seen in more than 20 million homes, the controversy perhaps drawing as many viewers as it repelled. And when awards season arrived, the film was honored across the board, a striking outcome for a production so many had tried to stop. Vanessa Redgrave won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress for her portrayal of Fénelon, the very performance that had generated such fury. Arthur Miller won an Emmy for his teleplay. Jane Alexander won an Emmy for Outstanding Supporting Actress for her portrayal of the orchestra's conductor. The film itself was named Outstanding Drama Special of the television season, and it went on to collect a Golden Globe and a prestigious Peabody Award as well, drawing 6 Emmy nominations in total. The scale of that triumph is best measured against how close the film came to never airing as intended. The protest campaign had pressured the network and its advertisers, and the controversy threatened the commercial backing such a production depended on. CBS held firm and broadcast it. The industry, having watched the film become a lightning rod for boycott and protest, ultimately embraced it almost completely. The performance that critics and organizations had insisted should never have been allowed was judged by the same industry's highest honor to be the finest of its category that year. It is one of the sharpest examples in television history of a work surviving the campaign against it and being vindicated, not by argument, but by the undeniable power of what finally reached the screen. The conductor of the Real Women's Orchestra, the figure at the dramatic heart of the film, played by Jane Alexander, was a genuine historical person named Alma Rosé, and her lineage was extraordinary. Alma Rosé was the niece of Gustav Mahler, one of the most important composers in the entire history of Western classical music. She was also the daughter of Arnold Rosé, the longtime concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic and leader of the famous Rosé Quartet. She was, in other words, born into the absolute aristocracy of European classical music, and she was a gifted violinist and conductor in her own right, having led her own touring women's orchestra in Vienna before the war. That a musician of this pedigree, carrying the blood of Mahler himself, should end up imprisoned in Auschwitz and forced to lead an orchestra of fellow prisoners for the entertainment of the SS is one of the most staggering facts underlying the entire story. The European cultural tradition that produced Mahler's symphonies and the Vienna Philharmonic and the men who murdered Alma Rosé's people were products of the same continent, the same century, sometimes the very same concert halls and cities. The civilization that revered her family's music was the civilization that built the camp she died in. Rosé brought a ferocious discipline to the orchestra, driving the women to play at the highest possible standard, because she understood with total clarity that their musical excellence was the only thing standing between them and death. Her family name had once meant the summit of art. In Auschwitz, it meant survival, for as long as it could. Alma Rosé did not survive Auschwitz. In April 1944, after roughly 8 months leading the orchestra, she fell suddenly and gravely ill, and she died within days at the age of 37. The exact cause was never established with certainty. Some, including Fénelon, suspected poisoning. Later researchers concluded the cause was more likely botulism or typhus, the ordinary lethal hazards of the camp. What is documented and almost unbearable to contemplate is that as Rosé lay dying, the notorious SS doctor Joseph Mengele signed an order for a spinal tap to be performed on her. Her death sent a wave of grief and fear through the orchestra, because the women understood that Rosé had been their protector, the force whose standards and whose strange standing with the camp authorities had kept them alive. Without her, their position became far more precarious, and the sense of safety she had built around them began to dissolve almost at once. After Rosé, the orchestra was led less effectively by another prisoner, and when Auschwitz was dismantled by the Nazis in the war's final stages, the surviving members were transported onward to the Bergen-Belsen camp. The woman who had carried one of the most illustrious names in European music died, imprisoned, and experimented upon in a death camp, and the orchestra she had built to save lives outlived her by only a matter of months before it was scattered. The film depicts her death as a loss of its moral center, which, by the survivors' accounts, it genuinely was. A mainstream American television movie in 1980, Playing for Time contained an element that was genuinely ahead of its era. The film portrayed a romantic relationship between two of the women prisoners, and it treated that relationship not as a scandal or a subject of horror, but with tenderness, sensitivity, and respect. At a time when depiction of love between women were rare, frequently mocked, or reduced to tragedy on American screens, the film allowed this bond to exist as a genuine and humane source of comfort between two people enduring the unendurable. This sensitivity reflected something in the source material itself. Fénelon's memoir had dealt frankly with the realities of intimacy in the camp, including relationships between women among the prisoners, and she had written about them with compassion rather than judgment. Notably, both the English and German translations of her book were slightly abridged in their treatment of this subject, softening what she had originally set down, a small act of censorship that reveals how uncomfortable the world still was with the material. It is worth pausing on how genuinely unusual this was. In 1980, broadcast television in the United States was deeply cautious about any depiction of love between people of the same sex, and when such relationships appeared at all, they were routinely framed as tragic, predatory, or shameful. For a primetime network film watched in more than 20 million homes, to present two women's love as a tender and dignified refuge, and to do so inside a story of genocide, was a quiet act of moral clarity. The film's willingness to portray such a relationship with dignity inside a story about the very worst of human cruelty was an assertion that love between people remained love, even then, and that it deserved to be shown as such. If you believe stories like this one deserve to be remembered and passed on, please consider liking this video and subscribing so it reaches more people. And if there is a film about this history that has stayed with you, share it in the comments so others might find it too. Now, back to the orchestra. Beneath the political controversy lay a deeper and more troubling problem with Playing for Time, one that has occupied Holocaust scholars for decades. The film was based on Fénelon's 1977 memoir, and that memoir was disputed strenuously and almost unanimously by the other surviving members of the women's orchestra. As Fénelon's book became an international success and the basis for an acclaimed film, it became, for many people, the definitive account of what happened inside that orchestra. The women who had actually lived it watched their shared experience be defined for the world by a version they considered deeply, painfully wrong. Their criticisms were specific and substantial. They charged that Fénelon's account was novelized and sensationalized, that she had reconstructed conversations that never happened, altered the names and characters of real people, and gotten basic historical dates and facts wrong. Scholars who later examined the memoir against the testimony of other survivors concluded that significant portions of it are, in fact, fictionalized. The frustration of these women was not academic. They had survived one of the worst crimes in human history, and they then had to watch a distorted telling of their survival become the one the world embraced, while their own corrections went largely unheard. For them, the film compounded the difficulty of being believed, layering a popular fiction over a truth they had fought to preserve. The single greatest source of anguish for the surviving orchestra members was the film's portrayal of their conductor, Alma Rosé. In Fénelon's telling, and therefore in the film, Rosé comes across as a cold, tyrannical figure, a harsh disciplinarian who admired her German captors and behaved almost as one of them, a Jewish woman who seemed to side with the people destroying her own. To the other survivors, this portrait was not just inaccurate, it was a profound injustice to the memory of the woman they credited with saving their lives. In their accounts, Alma Rosé was strict, yes, but her discipline was an act of protection and even love. They believed that her insistence on musical excellence, her refusal to let the orchestra falter, was the deliberate strategy that kept them alive, because a valuable orchestra was a spared orchestra. The cellist Anita Lasker-Wallfish, herself a real member of the ensemble, became one of the most forceful defenders of Rosé's true character. presenting her as a figure of remarkable strength and artistic integrity rather than the compromised collaborator of Fénelon's pages. The survivors also felt that Fénelon had cast herself too prominently as a heroine and savior, when in their memory it was Rosé who had held them together. The film, by faithfully adapting Fénelon, immortalized a version of Alma Rosé that the people who knew her best regarded as a betrayal. The historical reality behind Playing for Time includes details more chilling than the film could fully convey, and the life of the real cellist Anita Lasker-Wallfisch offers one of the starkest. Lasker-Wallfisch was a genuine member of the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra, a trained cellist who survived the camp and went on to become a celebrated musician and an essential witness to this history. Among the experiences she later recounted was being ordered to perform for Josef Mengele, the SS doctor who presided over the selection of prisoners for death and conducted monstrous experiments on the living. She was made to play for him a piece by Robert Schumann, the gentle, beloved piano and chamber work known as Träumerei, which means dreaming. Consider the image, one of the most cultured pieces of music in the European Romantic tradition. A tender reverie composed for children, performed by a young prisoner for a man who embodied industrialized murder inside a camp built for extermination. It captures the unfathomable contradiction at the heart of this entire story, the use of beauty as an instrument within a system of horror. Lasker-Wallfisch survived, wrote her own memoir to set the record straight, and lived into her late 90s as one of the last voices able to testify directly. Another survivor of the orchestra, by contrast, never played a single note of music again for the rest of her life. The instrument that had saved her had been bound too tightly to the worst thing she ever knew. The direction of Playing for Time carries a quiet piece of production history that few viewers ever learn. The credited director was Daniel Mann, a veteran Hollywood filmmaker whose career stretched back across decades. Playing for Time would prove to be the final film of his long working life, a somber and significant note to end on. But Mann was not the only person who directed portions of the film. Parts of it were directed by Joseph Sargent, another accomplished director who received no screen credit for his contribution to the finished work. Arrangements like this, where a second director steps in to complete or supplement the work and goes unnamed, are not unusual in film and television, often arising from scheduling pressures, illness, or production difficulties that require additional hands. What makes it worth noting here is the seriousness of the material. This was not a routine entertainment, but a dramatization of genocide made under intense public scrutiny and a punishing schedule of roughly 6 weeks, with the cast having rehearsed together beforehand in New York and the film itself shot in Pennsylvania. The demands of recreating Auschwitz on a television budget and timeline were considerable, and they required more than one director to bring the work to completion, with only one of them ever acknowledged in the credits. For Daniel Mann, the credited director, it was a quiet and weighty end to a career that had included major Hollywood productions across the 1950s and beyond. To close a working life of decades on a film about the Holocaust, made amid boycotts and protests, is its own kind of statement, whether or not he intended it as one. The collaborative, sometimes invisible labor behind the film mirrors, in a small way, the larger truth the film tries to honor, that history is carried forward by many hands, not all of whom are remembered by name. For a production that won so many of television's highest honors and drew so vast an audience on its premiere, Playing for Time spent much of the following decades in a strange obscurity, genuinely difficult for ordinary viewers to find or watch. For years, people who remembered the film's power or wished to study it reported being unable to locate a copy, with its home video availability tangled in questions of rights and ownership that left it largely out of circulation. A film widely regarded as one of the finest treatments of the Holocaust ever produced for the screen had effectively slipped out of reach. This near disappearance gives the film an additional, unintended layer of poignancy, given everything it is about. A work devoted to bearing witness, to ensuring that what happened inside Auschwitz would not be forgotten, itself drifted toward being forgotten, kept alive mainly in the memories of those who had seen it when it first aired. It was eventually given a proper home video release by a specialty distributor, rescuing it from total inaccessibility. But for a long stretch, it existed as a kind of rumor, praised by those who recalled it and unavailable to everyone else. People wrote that they had searched for years without success, unsure who even held the rights. The fragility of memory, the central preoccupation of the film, turned out to describe the fate of the film itself. This is the truth that gives the film its title, its full and terrible weight, and it is more harrowing than almost anything the film chooses to depict directly. The women of the Auschwitz orchestra did not only play private concerts for the SS or perform at the camp gate as the work details marched out and back. During the periods of mass extermination, when trainloads of Jews were brought directly to the camp and sent without delay to the gas chambers, the orchestra was made to play for them too. The music was a deliberate instrument of deception intended to soothe the new arrivals, to preserve the illusion that they had come to an ordinary place, that nothing was wrong, that they were merely being resettled. It helped the killing proceed smoothly and efficiently. That is the reality compressed inside the phrase playing for time. These women survived by making music, and the music they were forced to make was, in part, the gentle sound that calmed other human beings on their way to be murdered. They bought their own lives hour by hour by providing the soundtrack to other people's deaths, a moral horror so profound that the survivors carried its weight for the rest of their days. The film softens this, as perhaps any film must, but the history does not soften. An orchestra of doomed prisoners played beautiful music at the threshold of a slaughterhouse, so that the slaughter might be quieter. To understand that is to understand why this story has never let go of anyone who has truly heard it. So there you have it. 13 facts about a film that turned a Jewish survivor's memory into a national argument, that honored its subject while she disowned it, that immortalized one woman's account while the others who lived it cried out that it was false. It carried the name of Gustav Mahler into a death camp, won the highest honors its industry could give, then nearly vanished. And at its heart sits a truth almost too heavy to hold, that music was made to comfort the condemned.